Imagine this. You're a fur trader in 1883 Montana, and you stumble upon a remote cabin where a family of trappers has been living for decades. But as you step inside, the smell hits you first. Not just death, but something far worse. What you discover next defies every law of nature and human decency you've ever known. 3 generations of the same family, living together in ways that should be impossible, creating offspring that medical science couldn't explain for another century. The Trapper family didn't just survive in the wilderness. They became something else entirely, something that would make seasoned mountain men flee in terror and leave behind evidence so disturbing that authorities tried to bury it forever. If this story sends chills down your spine, hit that like button and subscribe. We uncover the darkest secrets history tried to hide every single day. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there, because misery loves company, especially when the truth is this twisted. Samuel Morrison had been trading furs across Montana Territory for 15 years when the blizzard of March 1883 nearly claimed his life, and while he thought finding shelter in that remote cabin would be his salvation, it became the moment that would haunt him until his dying breath. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and his horse was stumbling through drifts that reached Morrison's waist, while the temperature dropped so low that his breath froze before it could escape his scarf. And he knew that without shelter soon, both he and his horse would become frozen corpses scattered across the endless white landscape. That's when he spotted the thin ribbon of smoke rising from behind a cluster of pine trees about a quarter-mile off the main trail, and despite every instinct telling him that something felt wrong about the place, Morrison urged his horse forward because death by freezing seemed worse than whatever uncertainty awaited him at that isolated homestead. As he approached the cabin, he noticed that the structure seemed to have been built in sections over many years, with different types of wood and construction methods creating a patchwork appearance that suggested multiple generations had added to the original building, while strange symbols and markings were carved into the support beams and door frames in patterns that looked almost ritualistic. The smell hit him before he even dismounted his horse, a mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting meat, and something else he couldn't identify but which made his stomach turn and his survival instincts scream at him to turn around and face the blizzard rather than whatever waited inside that cabin. But the cold was already seeping through his heavy coat and the wind was picking up strength. So Morrison tied his horse to a post near what appeared to be a makeshift stable and approached the heavy wooden door that looked like it had been reinforced with metal bands and extra locks, as though the inhabitants were more concerned with keeping people out than keeping the cold at bay. When he knocked on the door, the sound echoed strangely, and after several long minutes, he heard shuffling footsteps and whispered voices from inside, followed by the sound of multiple locks being undone and chains being removed, which struck him as odd for such a remote location where visitors would be extremely rare and most likely fellow trappers seeking shelter just as he was. The door opened to reveal a man who appeared to be in his 70s, though his eyes held a sharpness that suggested a mind still functioning with predatory intelligence. And while his gray beard was matted and unkempt, his grip on the rifle pointed directly at Morrison's chest was steady and confident, showing that age hadn't diminished his ability to protect whatever secrets lay within that cabin. This was Ezekiel Murdoch, though Morrison wouldn't learn his name until later, and as the old man studied him with suspicious eyes, Morrison could see movement in the shadows behind him, suggesting that others were watching this encounter with equal wariness and perhaps even hostility toward this unexpected visitor who had stumbled upon their isolated world. Ezekiel had arrived in Montana Territory in 1845 as part of the Great Western Migration, but unlike most settlers who sought communities and civilization, he had deliberately chosen the most remote location he could find, bringing with him his young wife Martha and their teenage daughter Sarah to establish a homestead far from the prying eyes and moral judgments of organized society. The cabin had originally been a simple 2-room structure, but over the decades, Ezekiel had expanded it into a complex maze of interconnected rooms and additions, each serving specific purposes that became more disturbing as the years passed and his isolation from normal human contact deepened into something far more sinister. Martha Murdoch had been a delicate woman from a respectable family in Ohio, and she had followed her husband west with the expectation that they would eventually join a proper community where their daughter could receive education and find a suitable husband. But Ezekiel had other plans that involved keeping his family completely isolated from outside influence and moral constraints that might interfere with his growing obsessions. The first winter had been brutal, and Martha had struggled with the harsh conditions and complete isolation, often crying herself to sleep while wondering if they would ever see another human being again. And it was during this period that Ezekiel began to change from a stern but loving husband into something darker and more controlling, establishing rules and punishments that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with absolute dominance over his wife and daughter. By the spring of 1846, neighbors were no longer even a distant concern because Ezekiel had chosen their location specifically to ensure that no one would ever accidentally discover their homestead, and he began to speak about their family as though they were the only people who mattered in the world, while any mention of eventually returning to civilization or welcoming visitors was met with increasingly violent responses that terrified both Martha and Sarah into complete submission. Martha Murdoch died during childbirth in the winter of 1847, bringing into the world a son who lived only 3 days before succumbing to the harsh conditions and lack of proper medical care. And while her death should have been a tragedy that brought father and daughter together in grief, it instead became the catalyst for Ezekiel to cross boundaries that should never have been violated, treating his 16-year-old daughter Sarah not as a child who needed comfort and protection, but as a replacement for the wife he had lost. The isolation had already begun to warp Ezekiel's sense of normal human relationships, and with Martha gone, he convinced himself that Sarah's role in the family needed to expand beyond that of daughter and household helper, using twisted logic about survival and family duty to justify actions that would have resulted in his immediate arrest and execution in any civilized community. Sarah had been a bright, cheerful girl when they first arrived in Montana, but her mother's death and her father's increasingly inappropriate behavior transformed her into a fearful, broken young woman who understood that resistance would likely result in violence or abandonment in the wilderness, either of which would mean certain death in their remote location. Ezekiel began by insisting that Sarah sleep in his bed for warmth during the cold winter nights, and when she protested, he became violent and reminded her that he was the only thing standing between her and death in the wilderness, while also beginning to tell her that normal rules didn't apply to their family because they were special and different from other people. The physical abuse escalated gradually over several months, and by the spring of 1848, Sarah was pregnant with a child whose paternity was unmistakable, though Ezekiel had convinced her that what was happening between them was natural and necessary for their family's survival, and that outside society's rules were designed to keep families weak rather than strong like theirs. When Sarah gave birth to a daughter in late 1848, Ezekiel named the child Martha after his deceased wife, but the baby's features bore such a strong resemblance to his own that any observer would have immediately recognized the true nature of her parentage. And rather than feeling shame or horror at what he had done, Ezekiel seemed proud of having continued his bloodline in what he considered the most pure way possible. Sarah's second pregnancy came just 8 months after the first birth, and this time she delivered twin boys who both survived despite being born prematurely and showing signs of the developmental problems that would plague the entire family line. While Ezekiel celebrated each new birth as proof that his family was chosen by God to live according to different rules than the rest of humanity, completely ignoring the obvious signs that his actions were producing damaged and vulnerable children. By 1852, Sarah had given birth to 6 children, all fathered by Ezekiel, and the cabin had been expanded to accommodate the growing family while maintaining complete isolation from any outside contact that might reveal the disturbing truth about their relationships and the increasingly obvious physical and mental problems affecting the children. The oldest child, Martha, was developing normally enough in terms of physical growth, but she displayed disturbing behavioral patterns that included an unusual attachment to her grandfather and an inability to understand why other families might be different from theirs, having known no other way of life than the twisted dynamic that Ezekiel had established as normal and natural. The twin boys, Joshua and Caleb, showed more obvious signs of the genetic problems that would plague future generations, with Joshua suffering from seizures and developmental delays while Caleb had a cleft palate and partially formed limbs. Yet Ezekiel insisted that these were signs of their special nature rather than evidence of the devastating consequences of inbreeding, and he began teaching all the children that their family was superior to others precisely because of their pure bloodline. Sarah had aged rapidly under the stress of constant pregnancies, physical abuse, and complete isolation, transforming from a bright teenager into a hollow-eyed woman who seemed to exist in a state of permanent fear and resignation, no longer capable of imagining any life outside the cabin or any future for her children other than continuation of the same horrifying cycle that had trapped her. Ezekiel established strict rules about the children's education and behavior, teaching them to read using only the Bible and a few other books he had brought from Ohio, while filling their heads with twisted interpretations of Scripture that justified his actions and prepared them to accept similar relationships within their own family structure as they grew older. The children were never allowed to venture far from the cabin alone, and Ezekiel told them elaborate stories about the dangers of the outside world and the evil people who would hurt their special family if they were ever discovered, creating a psychological prison that was even more effective than physical restraints at keeping them isolated and dependent on his authority. When Martha reached the age of 13 in 1861, Ezekiel began treating her differently than her younger siblings, paying special attention to her development and making comments about her growing resemblance to her grandmother Mother Sarah, while Sarah herself seemed to understand what was coming and appeared to be preparing herself mentally for the inevitable moment when her own daughter would be forced into the same horrifying role she had been trapped in for over a decade. The family had developed their own twisted traditions and rituals around birthdays, holidays, and other significant events, with ceremonies that reinforced their isolation and special status while gradually normalizing relationships and behaviors that would have horrified any outside observer, creating a closed system where abuse was reframed as love and genetic damage was interpreted as divine blessing. Martha Murdoch became pregnant for the first time at age 14 in 1862, and while there was no doubt about the identity of the father, the family treated this development as a natural progression rather than the horrific crime it represented, with Ezekiel proclaiming that their bloodline was becoming even purer and stronger with each generation, completely ignoring the obvious signs of genetic deterioration that were becoming more pronounced with each new birth. Sarah, now in her 30s but looking much older due to the physical and emotional toll of her life, had become a hollow shell who helped deliver her own daughter's baby while showing no emotion or recognition of the horror of the situation, having been so thoroughly broken by years of abuse that she could no longer distinguish between normal family relationships and the twisted dynamic that had consumed their lives. Martha's first child was a son born with severe physical deformities including a partially formed spine and club feet, and while the infant lived for several months, his constant pain and obvious suffering should have served as a warning about the consequences of continued inbreeding, but Ezekiel instead interpreted these problems as tests from God that proved their family's special status and dedication to maintaining their pure bloodline. The younger boys, Joshua and Caleb, had grown into teenagers who knew no other life than the one inside their isolated cabin, and their developmental problems had created men who were simultaneously childlike in their understanding of the world and dangerous in their complete acceptance of their grandfather's teachings about family relationships and the special rules that governed their lives. By 1865, both Joshua and Caleb had begun showing inappropriate interest in their younger sisters, and rather than stopping this behavior, Ezekiel encouraged it as proof that his teachings about family purity were taking hold in the next generation, creating a cycle of abuse that would continue regardless of whether he lived to oversee it personally. Martha's second pregnancy resulted in twins who both died within hours of birth, their tiny bodies so severely deformed that even Ezekiel seemed momentarily shaken by the obvious evidence that their family's genetic isolation was producing increasingly damaged offspring, though he quickly recovered and proclaimed their deaths as God's way of taking the most pure souls directly to heaven without forcing them to endure the corrupted outside world. The family's isolation had become so complete that they had developed their own dialect and mannerisms that would have immediately marked them as outsiders if they had ever encountered other people, while their understanding of normal human relationships had become so distorted that they genuinely believed their way of life was not only acceptable but superior to the relationships between unrelated individuals that characterized normal families and communities. By 1870, the third generation of the Murdoch family had begun to arrive, and the children being born displayed such severe physical and mental deformities that even medical science of the 1880s would struggle to understand the full scope of the genetic damage that decades of inbreeding had inflicted upon their bloodline, with conditions that wouldn't be properly studied or named until the 20th century when researchers finally understood the devastating consequences of prolonged genetic isolation. Martha had given birth to 7 children by this time, but only 3 had survived past infancy, and those who lived showed combinations of physical abnormalities, developmental delays, and behavioral problems that created individuals who could barely function even within their isolated family environment. Yet Ezekiel continued to insist that these were signs of their family's evolution into something higher and purer than ordinary humanity. The surviving children of the third generation included a daughter born with severe facial deformities that made eating and speaking difficult, a son whose legs had never developed properly and who moved by crawling across the cabin floor, and another daughter who appeared physically normal but displayed such extreme behavioral problems that she had to be restrained to prevent her from injuring herself and others during violent episodes that seemed to come without warning or provocation. Sarah's younger children had also begun reproducing among themselves, creating a complex web of relationships where individuals served simultaneously as siblings, parents, aunts, uncles, and grandparents to the same children, while the genetic consequences of these multiple layers of inbreeding produced offspring who seemed to represent a different species entirely from normal human beings. The physical deformities were becoming so severe that many of the babies were born unable to survive outside the womb, while others lived for weeks or months in constant pain before succumbing to organ failures and developmental problems that their isolated family had no ability to treat or even understand. Yet rather than recognizing these deaths as tragedies, Ezekiel had begun teaching the family that these brief lives were sacred gifts that proved their bloodline was too pure for the corrupt physical world. The cabin itself had been modified to accommodate the special needs of the deformed family members, with ramps, special seating areas, and modified sleeping arrangements that allowed individuals with severe physical limitations to participate in family life, while the basement had been converted into a workshop where Ezekiel and the older boys crafted specialized tools and devices needed to care for family members whose bodies had been so damaged by genetic problems that normal furniture and household items were useless. Mental development had become equally problematic, with some family members displaying intelligence levels that seemed almost supernatural while others remained childlike throughout their lives, and the combination of brilliant but twisted thinking with profound developmental delays created individuals whose behavior was unpredictable and often dangerous even to other family members who shared their isolated world and distorted understanding of reality. The Murdoch family's isolation had never been complete, and over the years, several other mountain men, trappers, and individuals fleeing from civilization for various reasons had discovered their remote homestead and learned about their twisted way of life. But rather than reporting these discoveries to authorities or attempting to help the victims, most of these visitors had chosen either to ignore what they had seen or to participate in the family's disturbing practices for their own gratification. Samuel Morrison would later learn that at least 6 other men had found the Murdoch cabin during their travels through the Montana wilderness, and while some had been horrified enough to flee immediately, others had stayed for days or weeks, participating in activities that made them complicit in the ongoing abuse and ensuring their silence through their own criminal involvement in the family's depraved lifestyle. One of these visitors was a former Army deserter named William Crenshaw who had arrived at the cabin in 1871, while fleeing a court-martial for theft and assault, and after learning about the family's situation, he had decided to stay permanently, adding his own twisted contributions to their isolated community, while also serving as Ezekiel's enforcer when family members showed signs of wanting to leave or contact the outside world. Crenshaw brought with him knowledge of the outside world that Ezekiel used to further convince his family that civilization was corrupt and dangerous, while also introducing new forms of physical and psychological abuse that kept the family members even more terrified and submissive than they had been under Ezekiel's original system of control, and his presence created a layer of violence and intimidation that made escape or resistance seem even more impossible than before. Another visitor who had chosen to stay was a trader named Marcus Finn, who had discovered the family in 1874, and had been so aroused by their complete vulnerability and isolation that he had abandoned his previous life to join their community, bringing with him supplies and connections that helped the family maintain their isolation while also introducing new victims to their twisted way of life through his ongoing contact with other travelers and mountain men. These additional men created a network of silence and complicity that extended beyond the family itself, with each new participant having strong incentives to protect the secret of the Murdoch cabin, while also bringing their own criminal backgrounds and deviant desires to the community, transforming what had begun as one man's abuse of his family into a systematic operation that trapped multiple generations of victims while also serving the perverted needs of various criminals and social outcasts who had found their way to the remote location. The presence of these additional men also changed the family dynamic in disturbing ways, with competition for access to the female family members creating internal conflicts and violence, while the introduction of outside genetic material had produced some children whose paternity was uncertain and whose presence created additional layers of confusion and abuse within the already twisted family structure. Samuel Morrison spent 3 days trapped in the Murdoch cabin by the blizzard, and each day revealed new layers of horror as he began to understand the true nature of what he had discovered, realizing that he had stumbled not just upon an isolated family with unusual customs, but upon a multi-generational system of abuse, inbreeding, and criminal behavior that represented one of the most disturbing situations he could have imagined in his worst nightmares. The first day had been confusing and unsettling, with family members displaying odd behaviors and relationships that Morrison initially attributed to their isolation and primitive living conditions. But as he observed their interactions more carefully, he began to notice patterns that suggested something far more sinister than simple backwoods eccentricity, including the way adult men treated young girls and the fearful submissiveness displayed by all the female family members regardless of their age. The second day brought more obvious revelations as Morrison witnessed interactions that left no doubt about the sexual relationships existing between family members who should have been protected from each other, while also observing the severe physical and mental problems affecting many of the children and realizing that these deformities were not random birth defects but the predictable consequences of systematic inbreeding that had been continuing for decades. By the third day, Morrison had pieced together enough of the family's history to understand that Ezekiel Murdoch had created this situation deliberately and had been maintaining it through violence and psychological manipulation for nearly 40 years, while also recognizing that the additional men living in the cabin were not innocent visitors seeking shelter but active participants in ongoing criminal activities that included rape, child abuse, and possibly murder of family members who had attempted to resist or escape their situation. The physical evidence throughout the cabin supported Morrison's growing understanding of the horror he had discovered, with makeshift restraints, modified furniture designed to control movement, and hidden rooms that appeared to serve purposes related to confinement and abuse, while the family's behavioral patterns clearly showed the effects of long-term psychological conditioning designed to eliminate any possibility of resistance or independent thinking. Morrison also realized that his own safety was in serious jeopardy once the other men in the cabin understood that he had recognized the true nature of their situation, and he began preparing for the possibility that they would attempt to kill him rather than allow him to leave with knowledge that could destroy their isolated community and result in their execution if reported to territorial authorities. The smell that had initially disturbed him when approaching the cabin now made complete sense as he recognized evidence of poor sanitation, untreated medical conditions, and possibly decomposing remains of family members who had died from their genetic problems or from violence within the household, while the strange symbols and markings he had noticed on the building's exterior were revealed to be part of a twisted belief system that the family had developed to justify their actions and maintain their isolation from normal moral constraints. When Samuel Morrison finally escaped the Murdoch cabin after the blizzard ended, he rode directly to the nearest territorial outpost and reported his discoveries to the authorities. But rather than immediately organizing a rescue operation or arrest warrants, the officials who heard his testimony made decisions that would ensure the truth about the Murdoch family would never become public knowledge, choosing instead to eliminate the evidence and silence the witnesses rather than deal with the legal and social complications that would result from prosecuting such a disturbing case. The territorial government in Montana was still relatively new and struggling to establish credibility and attract settlers, and officials recognized that news of the Murdoch family's situation would create a scandal that could damage the territory's reputation and discourage immigration at a critical time in its development, while the legal complexities of prosecuting multiple generations of victims who were also perpetrators presented challenges that the primitive court system was not equipped to handle. Within a week of Morrison's report, a small military unit was dispatched to the remote cabin with orders that were never officially recorded, but which clearly involved eliminating the situation rather than investigating it. And when the soldiers returned, they reported that they had found the cabin abandoned and partially burned, with no signs of recent habitation and no evidence to support Morrison's claims about the family that had allegedly been living there. Morrison himself was warned that his story was not credible and that spreading such tales could result in charges of disturbing the peace or making false reports to authorities, while also being informed that his trading license could be revoked if he continued to discuss his alleged discoveries with other civilians who might be disturbed or frightened by such disturbing claims about the dangers of frontier life. The official records from this period show no mention of the Murdoch investigation or any military action taken in response to Morrison's report, while the soldiers who participated in the operation were transferred to different assignments and warned that discussion of their activities could result in court-martial proceedings for revealing sensitive information about territorial security operations. Similar cover-ups had occurred in other frontier territories when authorities discovered situations involving systematic abuse, criminal activity, or other problems that could damage the reputation of the developing region, and territorial officials had established informal protocols for dealing with such cases that prioritized public relations concerns over justice for victims or proper legal procedures. The remote location of the Murdoch cabin made this cover-up relatively easy to accomplish, since few people had any reason to travel to that area, and those who did would find no evidence of the family's existence. While Morrison's reputation as a trader who spent months alone in the wilderness made his credibility questionable to anyone who might hear fragments of his story in frontier saloons or trading posts. The cover-up of the Murdoch family case established a pattern that would be repeated throughout the American frontier period, with territorial and later state authorities choosing to eliminate evidence of systematic abuse, inbreeding, and criminal activity rather than prosecute cases that might damage their region's reputations or present legal complexities that their primitive justice systems could not handle effectively, creating a legacy of silence that allowed similar situations to continue. Without intervention or documentation, Samuel Morrison never recovered from his experience at the Murdoch cabin, and he spent the remaining years of his life struggling with alcohol and telling fragments of his story to anyone who would listen, though most people dismissed his account as the ravings of a man whose mind had been broken by too many years of isolation in the wilderness. And when he died in 1891, he took with him the most complete first-hand knowledge of what had transpired in that remote Montana cabin. The military records from the territorial period contain no official acknowledgement of the operation that eliminated the Murdoch family, but unofficial sources suggest that similar cleanup operations were conducted in at least 12 other locations across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado during the late 1800s, indicating that isolated families developing disturbing dynamics were more common than historical records would suggest, and that authorities had developed systematic approaches for dealing with such situations without creating public scandals or legal precedents. Modern research into frontier history has uncovered evidence suggesting that the social isolation and lack of legal oversight that characterized much of the American West created conditions that allowed systematic abuse to continue for generations in families that had deliberately isolated themselves from civilized society. While the primitive communication and transportation systems of the period made it easy for authorities to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses when such situations were discovered, the genetic consequences of prolonged inbreeding in isolated populations would not be fully understood by medical science until the mid-20th century. But cases like the Murdoch family provided early evidence of the devastating effects that such practices could have on human health and development, while also demonstrating the psychological damage that could result from growing up in completely isolated environments where normal social relationships and moral constraints did not exist. The remote cabin where the Murdoch family lived was never officially located or documented, and today the exact site of their homestead remains unknown, though local legends in certain areas of Montana still include stories about ghost families, cursed bloodlines, and abandoned cabins where travelers should never seek shelter, suggesting that memories of such cases have survived in folklore even when official records have been destroyed or suppressed, keeping alive the knowledge that some secrets of the frontier period were too disturbing for civilization to acknowledge or address through normal legal processes. The truth is, cases like the Murdoch family weren't isolated incidents but part of a larger pattern of frontier horror that authorities worked hard to erase from history. If stories like this fascinate and terrify you in equal measure, smash that subscribe button because we're just getting started uncovering the darkest secrets that shaped America. Secrets so disturbing they were buried deeper than any frontier grave, but we're digging them up one horrifying tale at a time.